19. On the other hand, the minority view was that the none of them is although none of them is superior, but the basic principle the nation is governed is the civil and the social and the economic welfare. So the parliament is well aware of its rights and duties. So it can pass any law for the purpose of justice principles, and it cannot be said that it has violated the basic structure of the Constitution of India. And the other was the Section 55, for which the both majority and minority was adherent, and they both said that the parliament has exceeded its jurisdiction, as the white section 55, the two clauses were inserted, wherein it has been held that the none of the amendment in the constitution would be cautioned if it is done for the purpose of excuse me, 1 minute please. The section 55 inserted clause 4 and 5 in the article 368. No amendment of this constitution, including the provisions of the part 3 made or purported to have been made under this article, whether before or after the commencement of the section 55 of the Constitution Amendment Act, shall be called in any court on any ground. Further, and the clause 5 was saying, for the removal of the doubt, it is hereby declared that there shall be no limitation whatever on the constitutional powers of the parliament to amend by way of addition, variation, or repeal of the provision of this constitution under this article. That means the parliament has turned itself into an absolute power, that it can absolutely amend the constitution. Not only amend that, it doesn't. The court held it amounts to that it can even change the constitution and it cannot be questioned in the court of law. So it violates the basic structure of the constitution. Both majority and minority held it violates the basic structure of constitution as declared by the Keshavananda Bharati case. So this provision is declared null and void. And the other judgment I will deal with IR Kohio. In this case, the question was referred to the larger bench that the fundamental whether on or after 24th of April 1973, that is the date of judgment of the Keshavananda Bharati case, when the basic structure doctrine was pronounced, it is permissible for the parliament under Article 31B to immunize legislation from any fundamental right by inserting them into Schedule 9. The 9-judge bench declared that it is not permissible for the parliament to enact any law, any legislation and put it into the 9th schedule, that it will be immune from the fundamental rights of the part 3 of the constitution. As has been held, the 3 articles, article 14, 19 and 21 are the basic triangle for the life of any person. So it cannot be said that once the legislation enacted by the parliament inserted in the part 9, it cannot be challenged on the ground of violation of the fundamental rights. So all the 9 judges in one voice said it can be challenged. Rather, they have declared a test, that is an impact test. What is the impact on the fundamental rights? So they said the greater the invasion on the freedom, the greater is the need for justification. and determination by the court. So first, the court has to see whether the enactment that is inserted in the part 9 is in violation of the part 3 provisions of the part 3. If it pass that, then subsequently the court will proceed towards checking whether towards delineating whether it is against the basic structure of the constitution as delineated by the Supreme Court in Keshwananda Bharti case. So for a brief, I think I will stop here. Then the other person can take. Thank you.
Very nice. Next. Who is taking? You can start your cameras also if you have a good bandwidth. Because this program we are recording and we will put in on YouTube and then share the link to all. Next, who is taking?
I don't know. So I can proceed with the other 2 judgments that I have prepared till the next.
Yes, yes. Vipul Agrawal.
If you want, I can start with Swiss Ribbons.
Yes, Apurva. Yeah.
Hi, good evening all. I'll just open my camera also. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
And visible?
Yes.
Perfect. So Swiss Ribbons, it's a 2019 judgment delivered by a two judge bench of Justice Nariman and Justice Sinha. The author of the judgment is Justice Nariman. So facts and issue here, the petitioners, Swiss Ribbons, they assail the constitutional validity of various provisions of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. The bench went into the question relating to validity, constitutional validity of the code. You can find this in para 1. I of course have some notes. I'll share it with in the group. Now the discussion here is of the bench.
Sorry. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the last thing which everybody heard?
2 sentences back.
All right. So here constitutional validity of various provisions of IBC was assailed, and bench went into the question relating to the constitutional validity of the code as a whole. And before going into the validity, what they listed out was the background of what insolvency laws were in India before IBC, why IBC was being brought in, and whether the legislature could be given that kind of a latitude, that leeway in experimenting in economic laws. So these are the 3 basic things which I would focus on, because otherwise the judgment is huge. There's no need for that. So background before IBC regime, you can find it at para 14 and 15. And these are extracted from the banking law, bankruptcy law reforms committee. So this report of the bankruptcy law reforms committee is very important to write, because this BLRC report is mentioned at least in 5 to 10 judgments, which are locus classicus now in IBC, like Innovative Industries, Swiss Ribbons, SR Steel. This is a very important report. Now, before IBC, this report observes that highly fragmented framework. There were different acts like Recovery of Debts and SICA, if you know about Sikh Industrial Units Act, and rights were separately defined. Creditors were having rights under some other statute, and debtors were having rights under some other statutes. They were conflicting opinions, conflicting judgments coming out, and due to that, insolvency of a debtor and recovery by a creditor was so slow that it even took 15-20 years. So what this committee holds, that there was a lack in clarity of jurisdiction. In insolvency, there is speed is of essence, and delay leads to atrophy. Now I'll just emphasize on delay leads to atrophy. What this means is that when a company is facing financial issues, Now, when they go into before IBC, in a framework before IBC, they go, and what happened was that some other management might take over the previous erstwhile management. They would start some litigations. Due to that, all the work of that company would stop. Since it would stop, the machinery, the plants, the supplies, everything would start depreciating. And once 10 years are over, 15 years are over, nothing would remain. So both the debtor and the creditor would not benefit from this. Therefore, this regime was being brought in. Now, what the court says, that there's the hands-off approach against economic legislation. Economic laws have to be given a greater latitude. Here, the court refers to R.K. Garg judgment 1981. Now, the reasons for IBC. Statement and objects and reasons. Consolidation of law. So IBC consolidates all the all the insolvency statutes into one, and it provides a time-bound manner for maximization of value of assets. Please note this line. Please reproduce this line. This is a very important line. Time-bound manner for maximization of value of assets. And this has been reiterated in the preamble also. So primary focus was on revival and continuation of corporate debtor. It was not a recovery legislation. This is not a mere recovery legislation. It is a very important distinction here, because previous legislations, they focused more on recovery by the creditor than the debtor. Here, it's not about recovery, and this will take importance subsequently, but this is not about recovery because they want to sell it as a going concern. Now, there were some ancillary issues. I'll just go through them. They are not very relevant, like appointment of members of NCLT and NCLAT. I don't think that's relevant for this purpose. Now, the very important part is classification between financial creditors and operational creditors, and whether it is violative of Article 14 or not. So Article 14 talks about equality among equals, and there has to be an intelligible differentia. Now, how the court has seen the intelligible differentia here? So definition of debts has been provided in IBC itself. There's a financial debt, there's an operational debt. Financial debt is basically, I'll just not quote the sections here. Financial debt is basically whenever some lending institution or a lender lends the money on the consideration of time value of money, which is interest. Operational debt is something which has been a money which is to be given for supply of goods and services. Now, this differentia we can see at para 50 and 51 of the judgment. FCs, that is financial creditors, are secured creditors, and OCs, that is operational creditors, are unsecured creditors. Objectives of both the creditors are different. So I'll just touch upon the objectives. This has been discussed in the judgment, but I want to discuss it now because that will help in understanding the judgment further. So financial creditors here, they lend it on interest. Now, just a second. So objective of financial creditor. Now, if he recovers the money, court holds that when he recovers the money, the financial creditor, like a bank, they will of course lend that money further to the different entrepreneur. Therefore, and that entrepreneur will make money. So if the money is not locked into the debtor here, then it will spur economic growth because this money will be lent again. However, operational creditor who just lends the money, who does not lend the money, but he is providing supply of goods or services, he is only interested in recovering the money for himself. That will not benefit the economy per se as to how recovery by a bank would be more helpful. So now we move on to this notice, hearing, and set off of counterclaim. Qua financial debt. Financial debt is defined under section 5, subclause 8, subsection 8. So that is debt against consideration of time value of money, which I have discussed. Then operational debt is defined under section 5, subsection 21, claim against supply of goods and services. Now, insolvency is triggered under 3 sections. Number one is section 7 by financial creditor. Number 2 is section 8 by operational creditor. Or number 3 is by section 10, by the corporate debtor, that is the debtor alone. They themselves can go before NCLT and trigger the insolvency process by saying that we don't have the money to pay to our FCs or OCs. Now, the information of debt, this is very important. Financial debt, this all the information regarding the financial debt, that is with the information utilities. Basically, when bank lends something to a corporate debtor, they have plethora of agreements in every at every stage. These agreements, all these information that is being sent by the bank under RBI framework to different information utilities. However, when there's a supply of goods and services by operational creditors, these kind of formalities that is not governed by RBI in any way. They are just governed by under Contract Act. Therefore, there's a difference here. When a financial creditor under Section 7 wants to trigger the insolvency, they just have to make an application before the authority. That authority would be NCLT. Now, NCLT, once that application is there, NCLT will send a notice for 10 days, just a 10-day notice that to the corporate debtor that you clear whether there's a default or not. However, when operational creditor has to trigger the insolvency process, they have to send a demand notice. Now, that demand notice, after receiving of that demand notice within 10 days, the corporate debtor can do two things. Number one, they can say that there's a dispute existing, pre-existing dispute was there, and on this statement alone, the whole insolvency can be excluded. Okay, or otherwise they can say, yes, we are under debt and insolvency can commence. So there's a difference here. Financial creditors are put at a better pedestal than operational creditors, and the intelligible differentia is that objective of financial creditors is different and OC is different. And number two, recovery by the financial creditor is on a better footing. And the third objective which the court has in mind here is, we'll go further, rather I'll go further here. Now, corporate debtor in this judgment, the judgment notices that corporate debtor has been protected against malicious proceedings under section 65 and 75. And then BLRC observations regarding COC being manned by. So what happens here is, just for general information, once insolvency process is triggered, a committee of creditors is appointed to oversee this insolvency process along with the IRP, interim resolution professional. This COC is exclusively manned by financial creditors. OCs don't have any kind of voting right on this. So that was one of the contentions of the petitioners, that is violated. What the court says that financial creditors can assess the viability of the company of the corporate debtor as a going concern, and not the operational creditors who are only interested in recovery. Para 68. To protect operational creditors, it's not that operational creditors are getting nothing in the act. To protect operational creditors, they shall not receive any amount less than the liquidation value. That is under para 70 and para 77. I'll just touch upon liquidation value. Basically, this is a value the IRP appoints valuers who see the assets of the company, the cash holdings and everything, and they come at a liquidation value that if this company goes into liquidation, how much money it might fetch. So and this liquidation value is provided under section 53 of the code, where the operational creditors are at the fourth place. So first IRP cost, then financial creditors, then secured creditors, and then at the fourth place they are operational creditors. So there's one exception to this rule, that is OCs are also provided seat, not vote. Under so if any operational creditor, he is holding more than 10% of the debt of the company, then he shall be provided seat in the COC. However, still then he will not be provided any kind of vote. Then the court touches upon section 12A, which is not violative of section article 14. So section 12A states withdrawal of application, basically the insolvency application, by 90% approval of COC. So the court says that since 90% is there, court is a collective process, collective process in REM. Therefore, 90% that kind of threshold is there. So 90% will generally include all the financial creditors of the company. Therefore, it is not violative of Article 14. Then the court touches upon the issue that resolution professional has no adjudicatory powers as against liquidator, which is, I don't think, any relevance for the purpose of this case. Then constitutional validity of section 29A, person not eligible to be resolution applicant. This is somewhat important. Now, there are certain categories of person under section 29A. 3 categories have been provided who are disqualified from appearing as resolution applicant. Resolution applicant is the one who submits his bid for to take over the stressed company, the corporate debtor. Who are these 3 persons? A and B are statutory disqualification. Either that person is statutorily disqualified or an undischarged solvent. And third is very important. It is disqualification of erstwhile management. I will not go into detail, but please understand that erstwhile management has been disqualified from participating in the CIRP, the corporate insolvency resolution process. Why they have been disqualified? The court says that, boss, you were the one who brought this company to the brink. So you cannot now say that, please let me buy out my company at a discounted value. That cannot happen. This is the crux of what the court has said. Then the court has also touched upon the issue that there is no vested right. The petitioner said that under section 29A, whether it's retrospective or prospective, court said that it's retrospective since no vested right is being taken away. Basically, no resolution applicant has any vested right of his plan being approved. Even any resolution applicant gives best of the plan, COC is within its power to reject it. And the court can do nothing in it. Court cannot ask them to approve of the plan. Then comes section 53. So if CIRP does not work out, then the company has to go into litigation. Under section 53, there is a waterfall mechanism. What waterfall mechanism is that in a corpus, for example, the company has 100 rupees. Now those 100 rupees has to be divided upon the staircase of a waterfall. So first, the IRP has to be paid off. The CIRP costs have to be paid off. Second, the financial creditors have to be paid off. Third, the secured creditors have to be paid off. Secured creditors can be debenture holders. They have to be paid off. Fourth comes the operational creditors. Then come the government and all. So this is how a waterfall operates. So there was an argument here that operational creditors may not get anything. Here, what the court has said that no, that does not do. Operational creditors are protected under the Act. This is not a violative of Article 14. So the conclusion here is legislation, since it deals with economic matters, this will pass the constitutional muster, and the legislature has right to experiment with this within economic laws, and we have to give a lot of leeway. So this concludes the Swiss ribbons case. If anybody wants to take over, please feel free.
Next, voluntarily come forward and try to give information in important points and try to cover maximum cases.
It is a time of revision. I do not want anyone to burden that they have not prepared that case like that. So I will keep myself concise. the Shri Kohito Holan versus Mr. Jachilo and others regarding the 10th schedule. It was there was a transfer petition and it was challenged. Supreme Court has taken everything on note. That was why it was taken. It was enacted. What is the need? Supreme Court has taken note that earlier there was two occasions when the schedule, when the provision was introduced into the constitution to tackle with the anti-defection, because there were some conditions like in a common language we call Ayaram Gyaram. When the political party joins the party where they see that there is an inclination to form the government or the ministries to be given to them for important portfolio, they leave the parent party on the from which they have come to the parliament or the legislature and join the other party which is appears to form the government. So ultimately this enactment was done by the 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1985. 10th schedule was introduced into the Constitution of India, which was challenged on the
Not audible.
Am I audible now?
Yes, are audible.
So I should go again or continue from where now?
Sir, start again, please.
Okay. So I am going to start on the Shri Kohito Holland versus Jachilo and others. It pertains to the Schedule 10 of the Constitution of India. The Schedule 10 was challenged on the various grounds. The earlier Parliament tried to introduce the provision to tackle with the anti-defection, wherein the political leaders, after getting the major seat, parliamentary seat from a particular party, they move to the other party where they feel that the party is going to form a government and they will be offered important ministry or other portfolio. So it was like Ayaram Gyaram. As written in the judgment itself, Ayaram Gyaram. So Parliament by the 52nd Amendment Act 1985 introduced Schedule 10, where was certain restrictions were imposed and the power was given to the chairman or the speaker to decide the question of the anti-defection if petition has been moved to the chairman or the speaker. It was challenged on the ground that it violates the Article 19, particularly freedom of speech and expression. And second challenge was that the paragraph 7, which have taken out the provision of the review, which is available with the Constitutional Court. The court was divided into two parts, majority and minority. That judgment was into 3:2 ratio. Majority held the provisions are valid, but applied the doctrine of severability, particularly towards the paragraph 7. It held that as it is the constitutional amendment has been done by the parliament according to the proviso of the Article 368, the state legislature has not been taken into account as it affects the power of the Supreme Court or the High Court. And there is a mandatory provision in the Article 368 if it affects the powers of the High Court and Supreme Court, so it should be ratified by the states. It was not ratified, the majority applied the doctrine of severability and upheld the other provision. The majority further held that the chairman and the speaker are of high dignity post. Once the speaker or the speaker, particularly as the Lok Sabha or the state legislative party, speaker is from the particular political majority party, and in the case of Rajya Sabha, it is a vice president. Everyone know. So particularly the speaker, for the speaker, it has held that it belongs the chair of the speaker has a high dignity, so it will maintain that high dignity. One cannot question that they will not decide the petition of the anti-defection within a time framework or in a neutral manner as expected from a adjudicating body. So paragraph 7 was held to be void and other provisions were upheld. Minority held the whole of the anti-defection law is violated of the constitutional provision, basic structure and other provision, because the para 7 cannot be severe from the rest of the schedule, rest of the enactment by adopting the doctrine of suitability. So, but one thing that was held, which usually is the case, that the interim order, one can say, cannot be challenged. It is only the final order that can be challenged in the review before the Supreme Court or the High Court, which leads to the various petition filed by the different persons, different political leaders, that the speaker are not deciding within a time-bound manner, and sometimes speaker keeps the petition pending for a long period till the end of the life of a legislature, which is usually 5 years. So then the question arises on this issue, as the speaker of the Manipur Legislative Assembly was not deciding the anti-defection petition within a time-bound manner. The challenge was made before the High Court, then to the Supreme Court, and in the K.M. Singh versus Honorable Speaker Manipur Legislative Assembly, it was held by Justice R.F. Nariman that although qua timid decision cannot be challenged, but Justice Nariman explained what is meant by qua timid, which was always invoked if challenge was made to any court regarding the non-decision. Justice Nariman held qua timid injunction is an injunction granted where no actionable wrong has been committed to prevent the actionable wrong or to prevent repetition of the actionable wrong. That means to further prevent the actionable wrong. Justice Nariman held that it is not that this is a case of injunction. It is a case that the speaker is not deciding within a time framework, although there is a lifeline to the Legislative Assembly of 5 years. So the court directed to the speaker to decide within 3 months. Within 3 months, the anti-defection petitions regarding the persons, MLAs who have jumped from a party, they have been elected to a party which have formed the government. So this is the thing, the qua timid has been explained in the latest law. Otherwise, the major decision is to be taken by the speaker or the respective chairman. Thank you for beating me.
Thank you, Saurabh sir. Apuro sir, you are next. Next judgment.
All right. Am I visible and audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So second would be SsangYong Engineering. This is 2019-15 SCC 131. Author of the judgment is Justice Nariman, and a two-judge bench of Justice Nariman and Justice Saran. Now, I'll just touch upon the facts. In this, the respondent, that is NHAI, invited bids for construction of a 4-lane bypass on National Highway In the contract, there was price adjustment allowed for cement, steel, plant, and local products. There was a certain formula given in the contract itself. However, a circular was announced by the government, and which the government said, NHAI said that this circular shall apply to you also for linking. This circular gave a new formula basically. So the appellant disputed the circular, said that no, this circular is dehorse the contract, dehorse the agreement which we have, and the agreement itself provides a formula. And disputes arose between the parties, and this dispute was brought before the arbitration tribunal. Here the appellant lost by a majority, that is 2-1. So two arbitrators said that no, this circular is correct, it will be applied to you. And there was a dissenting opinion, a dissenting award, who said that no, the circular is dehorse to the contract. So this majority award, section 34 was filed. Objections were filed before Delhi High Court. Delhi High Court did not interfere. However, Delhi High Court did say that even though the view of the minority arbitrator is very attractive, however, my hands are tied, I cannot interfere in this. Now, the issue framed by the court, one issue framed by the court was whether amendments of 2015 would apply to section 34 made after 2015 commencement date, that is 23rd of October 2015. In para 19, what the court held that was fundamental changes have been made in law. Expansion in public policy in ONGC saw pipes and Western GECO. So what happened was in ONGC saw pipes and ONGC versus Western GECO, Supreme Court expanded the scope of public policy. So these changes were done away with by the 2015 amendment, and a new ground, that is patent illegality ground, was added. However, that patent illegality ground was did have some exceptions. Therefore, court held that section 34 is prospective from the date 23rd October 2015. Now, the court discussed the changes made by 2015 amendment, the pre-2015 amendment regime and post-2015 regime. So pre-2015 regime, patent illegality was added by ONGC versus saw pipes judgment. And so there's a Renu Sagar Electric judgment of 1992. This is a 3-bench judgment where the issue was, a challenge was to award foreign award under section 7 of the Foreign Awards Act. Foreign Awards Act has been repealed. However, that section 7 incorporated grounds which are from New York Convention. So basically, Article 5 of the New York Convention, we in India follows New York has ratified the New York Convention. This convention is a convention for, just a moment, I've written somewhere. Basically, enforcement of foreign seated arbitral tribunal awards. This convention recognizes and enforces. Okay, now this is since a New York Convention, this imported New York Convention grounds. Therefore, even in 2019-20, Renu Sagar Electric is relevant. Post-amendment public policy is now fundamental policy of India. So this public policy, which was discussed in ONGC versus saw pipes and Western GECO, that has been completely done away with. In effect, court has overruled those judgments. The legislature in effect has overruled, and the court has given its stamp. Yes, these two judgments cannot be followed with regard to public policy. This public policy is now fundamental public policy of Indian law. So you can find that at para 34. Renu Sagar line was confirmed. The ground interest of India has been deleted, and justice and morality ground is now most basic notions of justice and morality. Public policy now means fundamental public policy, and award should be against most basic notions of justice. In domestic, see, there are two kinds of awards: domestic awards and foreign awards. Domestic awards, objections against domestic awards are found in section 34 of Arbitration Act. Objections against foreign enforcement of foreign awards. You cannot file objections against a foreign award in India before any court. You can only file objections against enforcement of that award under section 48 of Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Now, in domestic awards, a additional ground of patent illegality was brought in by the 2015 amendment. So what is this patent illegality? It must be on the face of award, going to the root of the matter, and not mere erroneous application of law. And there can be no reappreciation of merits. This is in para 37 and 38. Then the court says that construction of contract is in the domain of arbitral tribunal unless it is a view which is not even possible to take, or the arbitrator goes out of contract completely. So I'll repeat this. Construction of contract. Whenever a dispute under a contract is referred to an arbitrator or an arbitral tribunal, they are the sole deciders of the interpretation of the contract, the construction of the contract. However, if they decide in such a way, if they interpret in such a way that no reasonable person, no view can be possible, that view cannot be possible, or they rely on certain material which was never tendered in the proceedings. So in those cases, this ground can be brought into force, that is patent illegality, which is apparent on the face of award. That means apparent on the face of award means that only a cursory reading of the award, and you can say, no, this was the findings which you have come, that is completely not in consonance in what you have relying upon, the evidence before you. Then perverse decision under public interest. So ignoring vital evidence, finding on basis of documents not tendered, which I just discussed, that is in para 41. And court affirmed that Renu Sagar is the leading law as it contains grounds imported from Article 5 on Convention of Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Wars, that is the New York Convention. Now, there's a basic court went on now to most basic notions of justice and morality. So here court discusses in the facts of this case, what court says that full opportunity has to be given to a party to present its case. Now, what is meant by full opportunity? That is discussed under Section 18, Section 24(3), and Section 26 of the Arbitration Act, where parties are to be provided full opportunity to present case, where parties are provided full the oral hearing, parties are tendered all the documents. For example, claimant has submitted some documents, those documents have to be tendered up to the defendant. The opposite party submits some evidence tendered to the claimant. If at all the arbitral tribunal wants to rely upon some extra material, that extra material also has to be tendered to both the parties. So this is what full opportunity to present the case is. Then the court further went on to say that in Section 34, subsection 2, subsection A, subclause 4, dispute not contemplated by or not falling under submission to arbitration or deciding on matters beyond scope. So, for example, any dispute where the contract says that no, for example, in this case, it would have been that price adjustment is out of the scope of the arbitrator. But if the arbitrator would have ruled on that price adjustment, then arbitrator has wandered, of course. If I'm sure you must have seen various arbitration clauses, you must have read various arbitration clauses in various agreements. Now, some arbitration clauses say that in case of any disputes pertaining to the said agreement, parties shall mutually appoint an arbitrator. That is one scenario. Second scenario can be in case of any dispute, we shall this dispute shall be arbitrable before Delhi High Court, Delhi International Arbitration Center. That is by an authority. Third, where parties are not able to come to a valid conclusion that who has to appoint, then the parties can approach either the High Court or the Supreme Court in case of international commercial arbitration to appoint the arbitrator. So these three distinct possibilities exist. Now, in the first first scenario, any dispute, parties are saying that any dispute contemplated under the agreement is referable to arbitration. So if the dispute comes even touches the contract, then that is arbitrable. You cannot, after going into arbitration, say no, this is just ancillary. You cannot say that. Now, second and third, where, for example, the authority or the court, they have framed some questions that please decide the dispute within these contours, but the arbitrator decides the dispute out of those contours, then that can be covered under dispute not contemplated. So court says submission to arbitration refers to arbitration agreement itself or disputes submitted to arbitration. Disputes which are covered in arbitration agreement are also covered. The court relies on the judgment of Praveen and Enterprises, specifically para 67, and Praveen Enterprises talks about the three scenarios which I just mentioned. Now, this is a very important para 69, where court says that in guise of misrepresentation of contract, errors of jurisdiction, award cannot be held beyond scope. For example, one party says to the arbitrator, you don't have jurisdiction. Now there's a doctrine called competence. Please write it down if you want. This is a very important doctrine in arbitration law. Competence starts with not C but K. This is a German doctrine. Basically, competence says that arbitrator can rule on its own jurisdiction. And once that ruling has come and arbitrator has said that yes, I can adjudicate on this, I can take this arbitration, your only remedy then goes to section 34. You can only challenge the award. So court says that if there's an error of jurisdiction, go to 34. You don't say that this is award is beyond the scope of arbitration. You cannot say that. And what is most basic notions of justice? That is fundamental principles of justice which shock the conscience of the court in para 70. And so the court concluded that since the circular was something unilateral, foisted upon the appellant, the court overturned the award and set aside the judgments of the High Court. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I won't be able to do COC SR Steel. I'll circulate the note. Actually, I forgot my notes in the office. So I've asked the clerk by 6:37, I'll be circulating the note. Thank you.
Thank you, Apurva sir. Now I am reading some judgments. Common cause Registered Society versus Union of India. This judgment is depend upon the doctrine of separation of power. It is related to road traffic issue by NGO. Two judge judgment is this. HK Seema and Markande. Public interest litigation. Petitioner seeking direction to authorities for taking various traffic safety measures to control occurrence of the road accident. But court held fertile reaction to authorities as sought for by the petitioner amounts to legislative and executive action, which only the legislature executive is competent to give. Judiciary cannot encroach into the domain of legislature or executive. The court must exercise judicial restraint and must not perform executive. So this is very important here. It is clarified that the court can certainly not amend the law, Motor Vehicle Act 1988, Constitution of India 1950, Article 14, 21, judicial restraint, exercise of judicial activism, legitimate, illegitimate, like that. Doctrine of separation of power. Now, second judgment, my second judgment is a state of West Bengal versus the Committee for Protection of the Democratic Rights, West Bengal. This is depend upon also doctrine of separation of power and doctrine of basic structure. Here, direction given by Supreme Court to CBI to investigate in the state without the state consent. Constitution of India, this judgment is of 5 judges. Constitution of India 1950, Article 32 and 226, Article 21, Fundamental Rights. Fair and impartial investigation, judicial review, doctrine by direction by Supreme Court, High Court to CBI to investigate a cognizable offense committed within the territorial jurisdiction of a state without the consent of the state government. A court held in this will neither impine upon the federal structure of the Constitution nor will it violate the doctrine of separation of power, and shall be valid in law. State has duty to enforce human right of citizen, providing for fair and impartial investigation. Section 6 of the Special Police Act, Delhi Special Police Establishment Act 1946, Section 3, 5 and 6 investigation, Article 13, 32, 142, 144 and 2 to 6 judicial review. Everything is discussed in this judgment. Next, who is reading?
Yeah, I'll read.
Praveen sir, yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about the case number 63, of land acquisition proceedings. That is a Supreme Court larger bench answers the reference. Okay, in this case, the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation and resettlement Act 2013 was passed with a view to address various inadequacies in the existing Land Acquisition Act 1894. The 2013 Act contains provisions for enhanced compensation as well as rehabilitation and resettlement. The 2013 Act not only aims to safeguard the interest of landowners, but also other displaced and affected persons, including tenants and those whose main source of livelihood is dependent on the acquired land. The 2013 Act came into force on 1/1/2014. Section 24 of 2013 Act deals with the lapsing of proceedings that had been initiated under 1894 Act and were pending as on 1/1/2014 in certain cases. The Section 24 divides pending acquisitions as on 1/1/2014 into three broad categories. Category 1, where the award has not been passed. Category 2, where the award has been passed within 5 years prior to 1/1/2014. And option 3, that is category 3, where the award has been passed more than 5 years prior to 1/1/2014. The proceedings in the first and the second category, that is a category 1, is the award has not been passed and the award has been passed within 5 years prior to 1/1/2014. In these cases, the proceedings do not lapse. For cases in the first category, the acquisition survives and compensation are to be determined as per 2013 Act. And for cases in the second category, the compensation continues to be determined as per the 1894 Act. That means that in the first category, the award has been where the award has not been passed. In that case, the compensation will be as per 2013 Act. While in the second category, where the award has been passed within 5 years prior to 1/1/2014, that will continue to be determined as per 1994 Act. And in the third category, where the award has been passed more than 5 years prior to 1/1/2014, as far as this third category is concerned, where the award has been passed more than 5 years prior to 1/1/2014, the proceedings may lapse on fulfillment of conditions. Now, there are two conditions. One is possession of land has not been taken or compensation has not been paid. So basically, there are fulfillment of two conditions. One is physical possession of the land has not been taken, or compensation has not been paid. So there are two issues in this particular case. One, whether even the satisfaction of one of the aforesaid condition was sufficient for the proceedings to lapse. That is the question number one. That is, whether even the satisfaction of one of the aforesaid conditions was sufficient for the proceedings to lapse. Another issue was, if the landowners had refused to accept compensation, whether the deposit of compensation in the treasury would amount to compensation having paid and would save the acquisition. So these two issues are there. I repeat the second issue. If the landowners had refused to accept the compensation, whether the deposit of compensation in the treasury would amount to compensation having been paid and would save the acquisition. Now, the Indore Development Authority versus others, and Manohar Lal and others. That is Indore Development Authority. This is case 2. The 5-judge bench was constituted in IDA 2 to answer these issues and to resolve the conflict from the judgment in Pune Municipal Corporation case, a 3-judge bench, and the Indore Development Authority case, another 3-judge bench, that was the IDA 1. The apex court in the Pune Municipal Corporation case had held where landowners had refused to accept compensation. The money had to be deposited in the court. The deposit of compensation in the treasury after refusal would not be regarded as payment of compensation, thereby leading to lapse of proceedings initiated under the 1894 Act. The correctness of this view was doubted by the IDA 1, that is in the first case. Then it was referred to the 5-judge bench. The 5-judge bench overruled the Pune Municipal Corporation case and upheld the IDA 1 and concluded that the government's obligation to pay compensation was complete when it tendered or offered compensation to the landowners. It was also held that the government was not obliged to deposit the compensation in court of the landowners on the landowners' refusal to accept the same. I repeat, it was held that the government was not obliged to deposit the compensation in court on the landowner's refusal to accept the same. It was further held that the deposit of the compensation in the treasury instead of the court caused no prejudice to the landowner, and that the consequence of non-deposit in court was limited to a higher rate of interest payable as per Section 34 of 1894 Act. The court also held that non-deposit of compensation in court did not result in lapse of acquisition proceedings. Furthermore, it was held that the proceedings did not lapse if the compensation tendered was refused by landowners or reference was sought for a higher compensation. So another issue, go to the second issue, that was another crucial issue, was whether both the conditions mentioned in paragraph section 24(2), that is non-payment of consideration and failure to take possession, were necessary for the lapse of acquisition. Therefore, the court had to whether the or in the physical possession of the land had not been taken or the compensation has not been paid had to be interpreted as disjunctive or as conjunctive and / nor. So this was the question. It was held that two negative conditions are separated by an or. As per the principles of statutory interpretation, they had to be read as conjunctive, that is, nor and and. In light of this, the court held that the or in section 24(2) has to be read as nor and and. This implies that if the award has been passed 5 years or more before 1/1/2014 and neither the possession has been taken, nor compensation has been paid, the proceedings would lapse. However, if either of them was done, then the proceedings would be saved. This and the conclusion is that IDA2 judgment has put some crucial interpretational issues to rest. It might be seen as an escape route for the government because the acquisition proceedings initiated under 1894 can now be saved since government has may have merely tendered or offered compensation to the landowner. So this is what I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Praveen sir. Next.
I can continue with Roger Matthews.
Okay, sir.
Shall I proceed? Roger Matthews versus South Indian Bank. This is a judgment by 5 judges. 4+1, Justice Chandrachud has given a concurrent view. A court proceeded to frame 8 issues. The issues are whether the Finance Act of 2017, so far as it amends certain provisions of enactment altering the conditions of service, can be termed as money bill and validly enacted. Actually, the question was the Aadhaar bill was enacted and Aadhaar bill was enacted as a money bill. It was upheld in 2019, Swami judgment. Thereafter, in Roger Matthews, the question came whether it can be a money bill under Article 110(1) of the Constitution, because it provides certain restrictions what can be a money bill. So the court in this issue proceeded to say that this matter has to be referred to a larger bench of 7 judges because Swami judgment has already taken a view, and also L. Chandrakumar judgment has taken certain view under Article 226. So a larger bench has to decide whether this was a money bill and it can continue as a money bill, but it has to be struck down. The second issue was, if the above answer is in affirmative, if it was a money bill, then whether Section 184 of the Finance Act is unconstitutional or it suffers from excessive legislation. The court proceeded to answer this issue that there are certain judgments of the Honorable Court, including MCD Delhi judgment. It says that the legislature can delegate certain power to decide the issues, and it is not an excessive delegation. So they have upheld it. You can do that. The third issue was, if Section 184 is valid, whether the tribunal and appellate tribunal and other authorities qualification, experience, and other conditions of service rules 2017 is in consonance with the Parent Act and other decisions of this court on functioning of the tribunal. The money bill 2017, the Finance Act 2017, changed certain conditions of the appointments of the members of the tribunal, chairman, vice chairmen, and other members. So the court decided on this issue that the money bill, it is unconstitutional, it cannot amend, it cannot provide restrictions on the appointments, and certain mechanism has to be worked out for this. The fourth issue was whether there should be a single nodal agency for the administration of all the tribunals. The court has said that there has to be a nodal agency for administration of all the tribunals. And initially, it gave this onus on the Ministry of Law. However, the learned Attorney General made a statement that Ministry of Law is occupied in several other things. So it's still open, but the direction has been given that a nodal agency has to be established. Fifth, whether there is a need to conduct judicial impact assessment for all the tribunals in India. The court has said in an affirmative that there is a need to conduct a judicial impact assessment over the tribunals in India. Sixth issue, whether the judges of the tribunal set under the Article 323A and 323B can be equated in rank and status the constitutional functionaries. The court has that the judges of the tribunals cannot be the same status as the constitutional functionaries, and they have relied on the judgment of TN Session, which is Union of India, and they have also relied on the warrants of precedents, and it said that the judges of the tribunal are not at the same footing as the constitutional court judges. Issue 7, whether direct statutory appeal from the Supreme Court can be vetoed. The court was very apprehensive of the issue that the appeals from the tribunals come directly to the Supreme Court, and they have clogged the Supreme Court's roster, so that, and they have also given a citation of almost 24 tribunals from which direct appeals can come to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has also cited other jurisdiction that they have. So they said that these appeals should not be directly coming to the Supreme Court, and they have to be vetoed so that Supreme Court can function on other constitutional issues. And issue 8, whether there is a need for amalgamation of existing tribunals and setting up of other benches. The court has affirmed it that there is a need for amalgamation and setting up other benches, the tribunals. This is what I have. I have a question from the forum regarding L. Chandrakumar matter. The judgment that we have in our course is only a 5-page judgment. So is that the intention, or we need to go through the other full judgment as well, which is not in the course?
I had put this question up, but I think there has been no reply to this. So I think we will have to follow the 3-judge bench, which has made a reference to the 5-judge bench. So you might as well also put the conclusions of the 5-judge bench that will give us some more brownie points. Okay. And regarding the one which I was talking about, the lapsing of land acquisition proceedings of the Supreme Court with larger bench, there is a beautiful article which, from where I had read this, is by Aditya Tyagarajan. So you can actually download, Google it and download this article. That entire case is explained there very well.
Very good.
Okay, Aditya Tyagarajan. Okay.
This is very nice initiative, and after examination also we will keep to contact to each other by starting Monday club or Tuesday club, and every evening, once in a week in the evening, we will come on Zoom and we will just discuss on legal matter, legal solutions, and we can add a very valuable inputs in the our country's judiciary in future. I think this is very nice initiatives from all of us. So next. Yeah, Gurraj sir, yeah.
No questions.
Okay, okay. So shall we conclude here, or anybody is ready? Thank you. Only 1 week is balanced. So I think we should focus on our self-study, and we'll try to do regular practice of writing at least 1-2 hours, and revise the all notes, all case laws, and all the professional ethics principles. So all the best. And I think I conclude here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sir, one more thing, if you don't mind, can I ask you some questions? Can you please give us some outline, as like there was a on the Supreme Court website, there was mentioned that these all things are important for reading purpose.
Yeah.
Do we need to refer only those points only, or we need to refer other points also for studying for exam? Right.
Because there is no fixed syllabus, there is no fixed format of question paper. So we should be alert. And the most important weak point of this examination is 60% aggregate passing is there. So that is very tough task. But we practice properly, and if we are regularly practicing in Supreme Court, that time this examination is not difficult. But if we are practicing anywhere out of Supreme Court, and then for exam purpose only, if we are joining this examination, that time we have to take care of so many things. And I think e-filing questions on e-filing will be there. Latest judgment questions will be there. And a case note, they are providing us case note. But if we don't know the central idea of any case, that time it is very hard to find out the particular case note and write down the point. That is very important. And specific spacing, specifically drafting paper, we should have a proper spacing, which we are regularly maintaining in the filing, drafting of our Supreme Court petition, appeal petition, everything. So same spacing we should be live in paper also. So when we spaciously, that will be a better. If anyone want to share about the examination, they can share. All of you are invited by me on 23rd December at after 2:30 after 2 p.m. That means 2:30. Just come to canteen. If first floor canteen or down floor canteen will get together. We have a tea, and just I invite all of you and give this information to all other friends, just to celebrate after our examination. So thank you very much.
Sir, one more thing, if you don't mind. Sir, is there any uniform we need to? Do we need to wear uniform?
No, but you should not need to uniform, but you should be in a formal dress.
Yes,
Jean pant, t-shirt, like don't wear that dress. Just a regular pant, well shoes, and you should be well in manner like that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm ending now this session.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.